Chapter 21. The dust hadn't settled yet when Owen opened his eyes. He was on the hood of a car, the last one he'd jumped on, with his back against the windshield. Chris was next to him, unconscious. Other cars were littered around, some almost completely crushed by rubble. Something was digging into Owen's back, but before he could look to see what it was, a low rustle of gravel alerted him to something moving in his direction. He held his breath as the figure drew closer. Owen could see the silhouette of a man pushing through the dust. "If only you knew who you really are," said the figure, "you would not have stopped us." "I know who I am," said Owen. The figure stepped into a patch of light coming from the moon far above, and Owen saw it was Jason, blood covering his face and clothes. "Do you really?" asked Jason. "I made that orb. I knew it the moment I saw it. It's mine to do with as I want." He noticed a body lying a few feet behind Jason. He assumed it was Michael. "You're wrong about that, my friend. It's ours," spat Jason. "And the decision is not yours, as much as you'd like to believe that. The decision will never be just yours. Never forget that, brother. I hope you're ready to die for this world." Sirens wailed in the background. Jason became fully aware of them and tensed on the spot. He started backing away, never taking his eyes off of Owen. In the blink of an eye, Jason and Michael disappeared. The dust that had surrounded them puffed inward, as if filling the void the brothers left behind. Owen wasn't sure what he had just seen, but he also didn't care. He looked over to Chris, who was still passed out. Only then did he remember the pain in his back. He reached to feel for what was behind him, and his fingers touched upon a hard, round object. "It can't be," he said. He grabbed the object and brought it to the front so he could get a good look at it. Sure enough, it was the dreaded orb that had caused all the chaos. The orb, he knew, in some unexplainable way, belonged to him. And now it was back in his possession. Owen pulled Chris off of the car and carried him away from the collapsed garage. Cops surrounded their condo down the street, and some were headed to the parking garage now. Owen knew police had to have discovered Daniel's body by now, and it wasn't safe to go home. He couldn't think of any other place to go right now. And just then, he remembered Mr. Elfman was out of town. The old man wouldn't mind if the boys crashed at his place without his knowledge. At this point, at least, Owen didn't care if Mr. Elfman would mind. "What do we do now?" Owen asked Chris as they settled into Mr. Elfman's condo. Chris held the orb, studying it. Neither one of them knew what it had done after it had been activated, but they had stopped it before it could do any real damage, and that was something. "I think we should just chuck it into Trident River and be done with it," Chris said, handing it back to Owen. "I don't think that's a good idea. I mean, what if someone else finds it?" "Then let's destroy it," Chris said. Owen pondered this. "How?" "Beat it with a sledgehammer, I don't know." "What about Nikki?" Owen asked. "She told us to bring it to her." "Why should we?" Chris asked. "We stopped what those guys were doing, and you said Michael was dead, right?" "He looked dead," Owen amended. "Daniel and Alyssa were killed because of this thing," he added. "I want to know why." Chris had just woken up from his unconscious state and found himself in the old man's place. Owen had filled him in about what had happened after they'd fallen to the street, and how Jason and Michael extracted the knowledge of how to activate the orb from Owen's mind. Police were swarming their own condo down the hall, so they couldn't return there. Chris rubbed his temples. His head was ready to split wide open, and he doubted it was because of the concussion he'd suffered at the garage. "But how did you know how to activate it?" he asked Owen for the third time. "I told you, I don't know. I kept having those dreams about this thing, like I was the one building it. That's why I think we should take it to Nikki. Maybe she can tell us." "So you think you built it?" Chris asked. "I don't see how or why. I think I know everything about it, but, at the same time, I know nothing about it. Michael knew too. He knew what it does, but not how to turn it on. I knew how, but not what it does. It's like pieces." Chris looked up at him when he suddenly stopped talking. "What is it?" "Pieces of a puzzle," Owen finished. "That's what Michael said he and I were. 2 pieces of a puzzle. And when we were together, we completed that puzzle." Chris said nothing. He only stared at the orb, the puzzle. After a moment, he got up and went to the bedroom. "Let me just lie down for a second," he said to Owen over his shoulder. "I just need to lie down. Then we can go." Chris wanted nothing more than to sleep. His head throbbed and his body felt stiff. He felt he deserved to rest. The orb was now in his and Owen's possession. Michael and Jason had fled, defeated, and the world was safe. So why did Chris not feel at ease? Even as he lay in the bed, he felt he should be up. A sudden fear washed over him. He felt himself slowly fading away. He sat up from Mr. Elfman's bed, his heart racing. He was still infected by Eric. He had forgotten. Until now, nothing had come of that. He never felt the urge to feed on human blood. He didn't develop superhuman strength, but now he felt something odd. He suddenly felt if he fell asleep, he would wake up changed. Not in a coma like Stephanie, but completely changed. He walked over to a desk and sat, staring at Mr. Elfman's computer monitor. He slapped himself hard. "I can't fall asleep." He had no idea where this realization came from, but he felt it to be true. He was starting to panic now. He looked around the room for something to distract him. His thoughts dwelled on the bed, and how Mr. Elfman was out of town and, according to Daniel, that day Dee had snuck into this apartment, wouldn't be back for another week. With that, Chris figured he could catch a quick nap before things got busy. "No," he thought. "I can't go to sleep." The feeling he wouldn't be the same if he slept filled him with an overwhelming fear. He thought of going for a jog, but he was much too tired for that. He closed his fists. His fingers crackled. He felt so stiff. His mind felt empty, too. He was feeling even sleepier because of it. He gazed longingly at the bed. It looked so inviting. He spun in his chair to stare back at the monitor. The dark screen seemed to hypnotize him. The desire to sleep was growing. When Owen entered the bedroom, he saw Chris resting his head on the keyboard. He understood why Chris would be exhausted after what they'd just experienced, but he knew they couldn't stay here. The police were investigating the explosions that had plagued the building. Owen had been watching the news the whole time to see if they'd reported on any of the things that had happened in the last few hours. Nothing yet, so far. And the police were no doubt curious about the weapons cache and the dead body of Daniel Hudson. Owen Walters and Chris Weaver would most definitely be questioned about all of that. Owen called to Chris, who woke up instantly. Owen was startled by his blank expression. His eyes were empty. "You all right?" Owen asked. Chris didn't respond. He didn't even move. It was like he was frozen. He continued to stare at Owen, which sent a chill up his spine. Suddenly, something started dripping out of Chris's eyes and down his face. It looked like he was crying, but the tears weren't clear. They were dark and sappy looking. "Oh my God," Owen said after examining it closely. Something definitely wasn't right. He ran to the bathroom to get a towel, but when he returned, Chris was gone. Owen looked around the room. He searched the living room and kitchen, the other bedrooms and bathrooms. The condo was almost as big as theirs, though Mr. Elfman lived alone. Chris was nowhere to be found. Owen ran past the TV where he heard a news report. The reporter sounded excited about something, but he did not stop. His heart raced. It wasn't like Chris to just get up and leave like that. Owen walked to an open window, the one they'd crawled through to avoid the cops at the entrance, and looked down, preparing for the worst. He was happy to not see Chris's body splattered on the street below. He looked up at the sun, which was slowly rising. Something wasn't right about it. Instead of feeling heat radiating from it, he felt cold. Maybe there was something in the air. He went back to the living room and grabbed the orb from behind the couch. Had Michael and Jason succeeded in their plan after all? The orb felt warm and greasy in his hands once again. He felt nothing good could ever come from it. He had succeeded in obtaining it from Michael and Jason, and Michael was pretty much out of commission, but he couldn't shake the feeling this wasn't over yet. Owen saw Dee standing in a corner. The robot had been waiting in this condo instead of their own. Low blue lights barely visible in the sun-drenched room. In all the excitement, Owen hadn't noticed the front door open. He ran over to it, but before he could poke his head out to survey the hall, a cop ran by. Owen jumped behind the door and then slowly closed it. Chris must have gone out that way. Owen looked back to Dee. There was no way he was going to leave him, there all alone. But he couldn't very well take him looking the way he did, looking very much like a robot. A few minutes later, Owen and Dee casually made their way out of the condo. Dee had on a long brown trench coat and a fedora. He was walking with his head down. Owen wouldn't have been at all surprised if someone found them suspicious looking. No one had stopped them so far, so they kept walking until they got to the garage, to Owen's car. Dee got into the passenger seat as Owen tossed the orb in the back. "Ready to hit the road, Daniel?" Owen asked. The robot looked at him but said nothing, which was pretty much what Owen had been expecting. And then Owen caught what he had just said. He'd referred to Dee as Daniel. He sat there for a moment, contemplating that. D did stand for Daniel, he told himself, remembering how the boy genius had decided to name his creation. Owen started the car and drove out of the lot, making sure not to speed. There were cops all over the place. "Keep your head down," he told Dee. The robot did as it was told. Owen turned right on Calhoun. As he did so, he looked to where the parking garage had collapsed. There were people crowded all around it, and it appeared some police officers were fighting them back. Owen turned right on the next street, intending to circle back to the collapsed building. He had a crazy thought and wanted to check to make sure. As he approached Calhoun and 4th, he saw the crowd of people better. Most of them looked pale and weird, much the way Chris had appeared to Owen moments ago. 4 police officers kept pushing them back, but the people were insistent upon approaching the site. That's when Owen thought he saw who he was looking for. Someone who looked a lot like Chris was among the crowd. Before Owen could get a better look, a cop noticed him and approached his car. "Sir, you're going to have to move along," the officer said. Owen nodded and drove off, fearful of the officer noticing his robot companion. He got onto the freeway, trying to remember the way to his destination, but his thoughts suddenly dwelled on Chris again. Where was he? Owen kept asking himself. As he drove down the freeway, he kept glancing back at the orb. There was someone who might be able to tell him what it truly was, someone with strawberry blonde hair who could tell you anything you wanted to know as long as you were completely honest with her. And Owen intended to be as honest as he possibly could this time. He turned on the radio and settled in for his trip to Baker to see Nikki. As he drove, he thought of all the things he would ask her.